Hey guys, before we begin, a warning. This is not a story for the faint of heart. This is not a legend. This is not a myth dressed up as history. What you are about to hear is the true and documented life of a real man. A man who walked this earth in the 15th century, who ruled a real kingdom, who fought real wars, and who committed acts of violence so extreme, so calculated, and so deliberately horrifying that his name became synonymous with terror across 2 continents before he had even drawn his last breath. His name was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, and history remembered him as the Impaler. You may think you know him. You have seen his face in films, heard his name in stories, felt the shadow of the legend that grew from his life like a dark tree from poisoned soil. But the legend, as extraordinary as it is smaller than the man. The real Vlad, the child taken hostage, the prisoner who endured decades of captivity, the prince who held off the greatest empire on earth with nothing but will and terror and an absolute refusal to yield. That man is more fascinating, more complex, and more disturbing than any fiction has ever captured. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Now sit back and relax, as this story takes time to tell properly, and it deserves to be told properly, because this is the life of the man who inspired Dracula, the man who made a sultan weep, the man who turned cruelty into an instrument of government and wielded it with the cold precision of a surgeon. This is the full story of Vlad the Impaler. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world without mercy, a world of frozen mountain passes and dense black forests, where the wind howls through crumbling stone fortresses and the smell of wood smoke hangs over villages that have been burned and rebuilt so many times that the people no longer bother to mourn. A world where empires clash like titans across the rivers and plains of Eastern Europe, where loyalty is bought with blood and betrayal is the most common currency of kings. A world where a child could be taken from his father at the age of 12 and handed over to a foreign sultan as a living guarantee of his father's good behavior. This is the world that produced Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, the man history would remember as Vlad the Impaler, the man whose name, even 5.5 centuries after his death, still carries with it a chill that no other historical figure quite manages to replicate. But to understand Vlad, you cannot simply begin with the cruelty. You cannot simply begin with the forests of impaled bodies, the rivers running red, the nightmarish reputation that spread from the Carpathian Mountains all the way to the courts of Western Europe. To truly understand him, you must begin much earlier. You must begin in the cold cradle of a medieval world on the edge of collapse. You must begin with his father. The mountains of Wallachia still stand. The Transylvanian Alps, ancient and indifferent, rise above the valleys where Vlad III was born and ruled and died. The Arges River still cuts through its gorge below the ruins of Poenari Castle, where his prisoners carried stone and his enemies were impaled. Snagov Lake still reflects the sky, and the monastery on its island still stands, and somewhere beneath or near it, the bones of a man who terrified a continent are at rest. In Siasuara, the house on the Citadel Square where he was born has become a restaurant. Tourists photograph its painted facade and eat their meals in rooms that once sheltered the infant son of Vlad Dracul. History accommodates itself to the present in strange ways. In Targovist, the Chindia Tower still stands in what remains of the old princely court. You can climb its stairs and look out over the city that was once the center of his world, the place from which he administered his terrible justice, the place from which the forest of the impaled spread out toward the advancing Ottoman army. In Constantinople, Istanbul now, the Topkapi Palace preserves centuries of Ottoman history, the records of his campaigns, the memory of his raids, the story of the night attack, all of it folded into the vast archive of an empire that outlasted him by centuries. He died. His enemies died. The Ottoman Empire itself died in 1922. The Hungarian kingdom that imprisoned him dissolved and reformed and dissolved again. The Wallachian principality merged with Moldavia to form Romania in the 19th century. Everything he fought for, everything he feared, everything he built and destroyed has been transformed by the unstoppable river of time into something he would barely recognize. And yet his name endures. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, son of the dragon, the Impaler. It endures because human beings are drawn helplessly and perpetually to those extremes of human experience that reveal something true about what we are, the darkness we carry, the violence we are capable of, and the terrible complex question of what makes a monster and what makes a man. He was both. He was Vlad Dracula, and now you know his story. What do we make 5.5 centuries later of Vlad the Impaler? He is many things to many people, and this multiplicity is itself revealing. In Romania, he has long been regarded with a complicated mixture of horror and admiration. He was a defender of Wallachia against Ottoman domination. He was a man who imposed genuine justice, however brutal, on a society accustomed to the abuses of the powerful. He stood up to the greatest empire of his age and made it flinch. To many Romanians, particularly in periods of history when Romanian identity was under external pressure, Vlad the Impaler has been a symbol of national defiance, of the refusal to bow. A recent poll in Romania found him among the most admired historical figures in the country's history. To Western Europe, he became, almost immediately after his death, a byword for atrocity. The German pamphlets that circulated in the late 15th century established a tradition of seeing him purely as a monster, as a living embodiment of Eastern barbarism, of the terrifying and incomprehensible violence that lurked beyond the comfortable borders of the civilized world. This tradition fed into the Gothic literary imagination of the 19th century and eventually produced, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the most famous fictional villain in the history of literature. To the Ottomans, he was Kazikli Bey, the impaling lord. They respected him as a military enemy even while hating him as a torturer of their people. Mehmet II, who met him in the closest thing to a personal confrontation that two rulers of their era ever achieved, called him, according to later sources, a man of whom he was genuinely afraid. This from the conqueror of Constantinople. That is a legacy of a kind. To historians, he is a case study in the relationship between violence and power, in the psychology of a man shaped by trauma and captivity into something extraordinary and terrible, in the impossible moral calculations of rulership in a world without mercy. And to us, today, listening to this story, what is he? He is a mirror, not a comfortable one. He shows us what human beings are capable of when the full force of intelligence, conviction, and power is uncoupled from compassion. He shows us what happens when a person decides that the ends, security, order, the protection of what they love, justify any means that can be imagined. He shows us the seductive logic of extreme solutions and their costs. He also shows us the world that made him. And in that world, the world of the Ottoman frontier, of captivity and murder and political chaos, of an empire pressing against the walls of a small principality that could not afford to be weak, we see that Vlad the Impaler was not an aberration. He was a product of his environment, shaped and hardened and pointed like a weapon by forces entirely beyond his control. He is terrifying. He is also comprehensible, and that comprehensibility is, perhaps, the most unsettling thing of all. Ye have spoken of his actions. Let us speak now, as best we can, of his beliefs. Vlad III was, above everything else in his inner life, an Orthodox Christian. This was not separate from his political identity. In the world of 15th century Eastern Europe, religion and politics were inseparable. The Orthodox Church was the cultural backbone of Romanian identity, the institution that distinguished Wallachia and Moldavia from their Catholic Hungarian neighbors and their Muslim Ottoman overlords. To be Orthodox was to be Romanian, in the deepest sense of the word. To defend orthodoxy was to defend the people, the land, the civilization. Vlad understood himself as a defender of Christendom. His war against the Ottomans was, in his own framing and in the framing of his supporters, a crusade, a holy war in defense of the cross against the crescent. He was not alone in this framing. The entire rhetoric of the anti-Ottoman resistance in 15th century Eastern Europe was saturated with crusading ideology. But Vlad carried this framing with an intensity and conviction that went beyond mere rhetoric. He believed it. He had organized his entire existence around it. His donations to monasteries, his founding of churches, his support for the Orthodox clergy. These were not simply political patronage, though they were that too. They were expressions of a genuine piety, a genuine desire to stand before God as a man who had done his duty in a terrible world. The churches he built, some of which still stand in Romania today, speak to a man who cared about the survival of his faith and its institutions. And yet, the theology of the Orthodox Church, like that of every Christian church, contained certain clear prohibitions. Prohibitions against murder, against cruelty, against the taking of innocent life. How did Vlad reconcile his genuine faith with the rivers of blood he spilled? The answer, as best we can reconstruct it, lies in his understanding of justice. For Vlad, justice was not a set of abstract principles to be weighed and balanced. It was an absolute demand. His universe was one of moral clarity. People were guilty or innocent, loyal or treacherous, useful or dangerous. The guilty, the treacherous, the dangerous deserved punishment, and the punishment should be commensurate with the crime, not in the gentle, proportionate way of a modern legal system, but in the absolute, overwhelming way that he believed would actually work. A thief who faced minor punishment would steal again. A traitor who faced exile might return. Only the most extreme consequences produced the most absolute deterrence. He also believed, quite genuinely, that the protection of the innocent required the destruction of the guilty. In his world, where the Ottoman Empire was always pressing at the borders, where the boyar class had repeatedly destabilized Wallachian governance with their factional games, where the common people of his principality were at constant risk of being raided, enslaved, and killed by external enemies, the luxury of mercy was not available, or so he believed. Mercy toward the powerful meant weakness, and weakness meant the suffering of the powerless. This is a logic that is not entirely without internal coherence. It is a logic that has been applied, in various forms, by rulers and regimes throughout history. The argument that extreme violence in the service of order ultimately produces less total suffering than the disorder it prevents. It is a logic that is, in the judgment of history and of conscience, inadequate. It does not account for the possibility that the violence itself creates the disorder it claims to prevent. It does not account for the dehumanization of the people it is applied to. It does not account for the corrupting effect of absolute power on the person who wields it. But Vlad III lived in a world that offered precious little guidance toward gentler alternatives. He had been shaped by a world of absolute ruthlessness, Ottoman captivity, the murder of his family, decades of political violence and instability. The tools he had were the tools he had been given by that world. He used them with maximum force. What did he think of himself? This is perhaps the most unanswerable question. He never wrote personal reflections. He left no confessional documents, but the actions he took suggest a man who believed, with absolute conviction, that what he was doing was right. Not merely necessary, but right. He showed no signs of guilt, no signs of psychological torment over the suffering he caused. This is either the mark of a man whose conscience had been entirely suppressed, or, perhaps more disturbingly, of a man who had genuinely integrated his violence into a coherent moral framework that he experienced not as an exception to his values, but as an expression of them. He valued loyalty above almost every other quality. Disloyalty was, in his view, perhaps the most serious of all crimes. It destroyed the trust that held communities together. It enabled enemies to destroy what had been built. It was, ultimately, the thing that had killed his father and his brother and driven him into exile. He punished disloyalty with a savagery that went beyond even his usual severity, because to him it was not merely a crime. It was a betrayal of the fundamental compact that made human society possible. He valued strength, not the cruel, bullying strength of someone who enjoys domination, but the hard-edged strength of someone who has survived by being stronger than everything that tried to break him. In his worldview, weakness was not a misfortune. It was a moral failing. A prince who allowed himself to be weak invited the suffering of those he was supposed to protect. He would not be weak. He valued order. The horror of the forest of impaled bodies was, in his own understanding, the price of order. Without that horror, without that overwhelming demonstration of consequences, the order would not hold. He may have been right about this. In the narrow, pragmatic sense, Wallachia under his rule was, in many respects, more orderly and more just in its basic functioning than Wallachia under most of his predecessors or successors. The price was not negligible, and he valued Wallachia itself, his homeland, the land of the mountains and the Danube plain, the people who lived in its villages and farmed its valleys and worked its mines. He was not a perfect defender of those people. His methods caused enormous suffering among them, as well as among his enemies. But the love of country, the sense of responsibility for the survival of a people and a culture, appears to have been genuine. He died, ultimately fighting for it. From his imprisonment in Hungary, Vlad III had watched Wallachia continue in its turbulent way. His brother Radu the Handsome had ruled as an Ottoman vassal until his death in 1473, and the throne had then passed through several more hands in the usual chaotic fashion. In 1475 or 1476, the political winds finally shifted in Vlad's favor. An alliance was forming between Hungary and Moldavia against the Ottomans, and Vlad's credentials as the most ferocious and effective anti-Ottoman fighter in the region had, if anything, grown more impressive with the passage of time. His reputation was formidable across Eastern Europe, feared by the Ottomans, respected, if uncomfortably so, by the Hungarians and their allies. He was released from Hungarian custody, given a military command, and began once again to fight his way toward the throne of Wallachia. In late 1476, Vlad retook the Wallachian throne for the third time. It had taken him approximately 30 years of fighting, imprisonment, exile, and waiting to arrive at this point. He was in his mid-40s now, an old man by the standards of the 15th century, though almost certainly physically hardened by decades of military life. He had outlived his father, his brothers, and most of the enemies who had shaped the course of his life. His third reign lasted barely 2 months. The circumstances of his death are, characteristically for this entire story, wrapped in ambiguity and conflicting accounts. What is certain is that he died in battle, or in the immediate aftermath of a battle, somewhere in the vicinity of Bucharest, in late December of 1476 or early January of 1477. He was killed fighting Ottoman forces, or fighting a rival claimant backed by the Ottomans, depending on which source you consult. Some accounts say he was killed by his own men, that in the confusion of battle, his own soldiers mistook him for an Ottoman and cut him down. There is a dark poetry to this, if true. The man who had terrorized all of Wallachia into submission, who had been more feared than any enemy, killed accidentally by those he led. Other accounts say he was simply overwhelmed in battle by superior numbers and died fighting. His head was cut off. This was standard practice for an enemy of the Ottoman Sultan. Proof of death was required, and the head could be taken to Constantinople, preserved in honey as was the custom, and displayed as evidence of the Sultan's triumph. The decapitation appears to have happened. His head was sent to Constantinople, where Mehmed II displayed it publicly. His body was buried, according to tradition, at the Snagov Monastery on its island in Snagov Lake. The monastery had been under his patronage during his reign. It was a place he had supported and built. In the tradition of Orthodox princes, who often chose the monasteries of their patronage as their final resting places, It makes complete sense that he would be buried there. Excavations of Snagove in the 20th century produced ambiguous results. Human remains were found in what was believed to be the princely grave, but the identification is uncertain. Some researchers believe Vlad was actually buried elsewhere. The mystery of his final resting place is, perhaps fittingly, unresolved. He died as he had lived, in violence, in movement, in the middle of a struggle that never quite ended. He was approximately 45 years old. He had ruled Wallachia for a total of roughly 7 years across 3 separate reigns, with decades of captivity and exile in between. By the standards of his time and place, it was not an unusual life in its instability, but in the intensity of what he made of that life, in the concentrated force of his personality and the scale of the violence he unleashed, he was singular. The arrest of Vlad III in late 1462 is one of the most debated events of his entire life. Who ordered it? Why? King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary had received those letters from Vlad describing the raids into Ottoman territory with their enormous casualty counts. At some point, possibly before Vlad was arrested, possibly after, Matthias began circulating a set of documents that purported to show Vlad had been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans, offering to betray Hungary in exchange for Ottoman support. These documents were almost certainly forgeries. They were almost certainly created or commissioned by Matthias himself, or by parties in his court who wished to discredit Vlad. Why would Matthias want to arrest Vlad, rather than support him? The most likely explanation is financial and political. Matthias had received significant funds from Pope Pius II to support a crusade against the Ottomans. He had not, in fact, used these funds for a crusade. He had used them for his own political purposes. If Vlad arrived at the Hungarian court as a heroic crusading prince who had actually been fighting the Ottomans while Matthias was taking crusade money and doing nothing, the embarrassment would be considerable. Far better to arrest Vlad, brand him a traitor, and present this to the Pope as evidence that the crusading effort had been complicated by treachery rather than by Matthias's own inaction. This is the most widely accepted interpretation among modern historians. Though it remains a matter of some debate, whatever the reasons, Vlad was imprisoned, and he would remain a prisoner of the Hungarians for approximately 12 years. From 1462 to around 1474 or 1475, 12 years of imprisonment. After 6 years of captivity as a child, it is one of the remarkable ironies of his life that a man so obsessively focused on control, on absolute dominance, on the elimination of any constraint on his power, spent more of his life as someone else's prisoner than as a free ruler. The conditions of his imprisonment appear to have changed over time. Initially, he was held in a tower, probably in Visegrad, the Hungarian royal palace complex, on the Danube bend north of Buda. Over the years, as the immediate political crisis faded and Matthias found Vlad more useful as an ally than as a prisoner, the conditions relaxed considerably. By the later years of his imprisonment, Vlad was living in relatively comfortable captivity, allowed to hunt, to move around to some degree, and eventually even to remarry, his second wife being a member of the extended Hunyadi family, cementing his connection to the Hungarian political establishment. He was also, according to some accounts, converting to Catholicism during this period, or at least performing the gestures of conversion, which would have been a pragmatic move to improve his position with the Hungarian king. Whether this represented any genuine change in his religious identity is impossible to say, given his deep attachment to Orthodox Christianity, which was tied not just to personal faith, but to his entire sense of Wallachian identity and political mission. A true conversion seems unlikely. A performative one, calculated to please his captors, is entirely consistent with what we know of his character. It was also during this period that the stories about Vlad began to spread most widely in Western Europe. The German pamphlets, printed in Nuremberg, Strasbourg, and elsewhere from approximately 1462 onward, circulated accounts of his atrocities that were read eagerly by a public fascinated and horrified by tales from the eastern frontier. These pamphlets carried woodcuts, crude but powerfully evocative images of Vlad dining among forests of impaled bodies, of executions and tortures carried out with nightmarish creativity. They were among the most widely circulated printed texts of the early age of printing, and they fixed Vlad's image in the European imagination as a monster of unprecedented proportions. There is also a tantalizing connection, much discussed by scholars, between the historical Vlad and the Dracula of Bram Stoker's famous 1897 novel. Stoker did use the name Dracula, did place his vampire count in Transylvania, and did have access to some materials about the historical Vlad. Whether the historical Vlad was a significant source for the fictional count is debated, but the connection, even if partial and indirect, has ensured that Vlad the Impaler's name will resonate as long as the vampire count Dracula resonates, which appears to be indefinitely. No account of Vlad the Impaler is complete without understanding his relationship with the Ottoman Empire, because it was this relationship, more than anything else, that defined his political existence and gave his reign its world historical significance. By the time Vlad began his second reign in 1456, the Ottoman pressure on Wallachia had become intolerable. Sultan Mehmed II had just taken Constantinople and was pressing aggressively westward. He demanded that Wallachia pay its annual tribute, a substantial payment that acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty, and he demanded that Vlad personally appear at the Ottoman court to pay homage. Vlad refused. This was not an act of impulse. It was a carefully considered strategic decision. Vlad had concluded, probably correctly, that appearing at the Ottoman court would be the equivalent of walking into a trap. He would be arrested, possibly executed, and replaced with a more compliant ruler. He had seen what the Ottomans did with hostages. He had been one. Instead, he did something extraordinary. He launched an offensive. In the winter of 1461 to 1462, Vlad crossed the Danube with his army and launched a devastating raid into Ottoman Bulgarian territory. The raid was not a conventional invasion. He did not have the forces for that. Instead, it was a calculated act of destruction and psychological aggression. His forces swept through a stretch of territory roughly 500 kilometers long, burning towns and villages, killing soldiers and civilians alike. And in the aftermath of this raid, Vlad sent a letter to the King of Hungary, Matthias Corvinus, describing what he had done. He reported the number of Ottomans killed. The number was enormous, somewhere between 23,000 and 24,000 by his own count, and he claimed to have documented this precisely, with separate tallies for different categories of killed. The letter is a remarkable document, at once a military report and a manifesto of absolute commitment to the anti-Ottoman cause, simultaneously horrifying in its clinical cataloging of mass killing and oddly principled in its insistence that he is fighting a war of genuine civilizational importance. The Ottoman response was swift and overwhelming. In the spring of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II himself led an army into Wallachia. The force was enormous. Contemporary sources, which tend to exaggerate, describe armies of 100,000 or more. But even if the real number was 20 or 30,000, it was vastly larger than anything Vlad could field in open battle. Mehmed came personally. This was a measure of how seriously the Sultan took the threat posed by Vlad. The conqueror of Constantinople was not going to delegate the punishment of this insolent prince to anyone else. Vlad responded with the tactics of a man who knew he could not fight his enemy in the open. He retreated, burning everything behind him. He practiced a total scorched earth strategy, destroying crops, poisoning wells, driving livestock away, leaving nothing for the advancing Ottoman army to forage or plunder. He harassed the Ottoman flanks with cavalry raids, striking fast and disappearing back into the forests. He used the terrain he knew intimately against an enemy that was operating in unfamiliar country. And then, in a moment of almost incomprehensible audacity, on the night of June 16th and 17, 1462, Vlad launched what is known as the night attack at Targovist. or the night attack of the sword. He took a force of cavalry, perhaps 10,000 men, possibly fewer, sources vary considerably, and launched a night raid directly at the heart of the Ottoman camp. The objective was nothing less than the assassination of Sultan Mehmed II himself. If Vlad could kill the Sultan in the confusion of a night attack, the Ottoman army would collapse, the invasion would end, and Wallachia would be saved. The raid was brilliantly executed. Vlad's forces penetrated deep into the Ottoman camp in the darkness, causing chaos and carnage. They reached what they believed was Mehmed's tent, but Mehmed had been warned, whether through a spy, or simply through the diligence of his guards, or through his own instinct, and he had relocated before the attack reached him. The Sultan survived. Vlad's cavalry fought their way back out through the chaos, leaving thousands of Ottoman dead behind them, and inflicting considerable psychological damage on an army that had just discovered that the man they were hunting was perfectly capable of attacking them at the heart of their own camp in the middle of the night. It was one of the most extraordinary military actions of the entire 15th century. And it was not enough. Mehmed continued his advance. He reached Targov East and found the forest of the impaled. He reportedly wept. He reportedly called Vlad a man whom he feared. And then he retreated, returning south across the Danube without having captured Vlad or decisively defeated his forces. By some measures, this was a victory for Vlad. He had held off the most powerful military force in the world, killed enormous numbers of Ottoman soldiers, and driven the Sultan himself to retreat. But the campaign had consumed his resources and exhausted his support. The boyars who had survived his earlier purges were plotting. The Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, who had promised support, had not delivered it. And most devastatingly of all, his own brother Radu, beautiful, Ottoman-aligned Radu the Handsome, had crossed back into Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman-backed force, offering the boyars and the populace an alternative to the terror of Vlad's rule. Much of the country switched sides. It is perhaps not surprising. 6 years of Vlad's rule had kept Wallachia safe and well-ordered, but they had also been 6 years of extraordinary violence, of watching neighbors, relatives, and associates impaled, of living under a justice so severe and so personal that any minor infraction could prove fatal. When Radu appeared with Ottoman backing and promises of milder governance, the population was not entirely resistant to the change. Vlad, abandoned by most of his supporters, fled north toward the mountains. He was heading for Transylvania, intending to seek the support of the Hungarian king. But things went very badly wrong at the border. He was arrested. What was daily life like for Vlad the Impaler? How did this man who created such horror actually live from morning to night? He rose early. As a military commander and prince in an era of constant threats, late sleeping was a luxury he could not afford. His mornings likely began with prayer, because whatever else Vlad was, he was a genuinely devout Orthodox Christian. His faith was not cynical or performative. The Orthodox Church played a central role in his understanding of his own identity and his political mission. He donated generously to Orthodox monasteries throughout his reign, including the famous monastery at Snagov on an island in Snagov Lake, just south of Targov East, which is traditionally associated with his burial. He founded churches, supported the clergy, and framed his war against the Ottomans explicitly as a crusade in defense of the Christian faith. This is one of the deeply unsettling paradoxes of Vlad the Impaler, a man who prayed with what appears to have been sincere devotion, who understood himself as a defender of Christ's people, and who simultaneously engaged in acts of mass cruelty that would have horrified most Christian theologians of his era. He reconciled these aspects of himself in ways we can only speculate at. Perhaps he saw the cruelty as a necessary sacrifice, the willingness to do terrible things in defense of a higher purpose. Perhaps he drew a sharp line between the violence he performed in the service of order and justice and the grace he sought in his private devotions. Perhaps he simply did not feel the need to justify himself at all after morning prayers, the business of governing. Vlad was, by all accounts, intensely hands-on as a ruler. He did not delegate justice. He administered it personally. He heard cases directly, making judgments that were immediate and final. There was no appeal from Vlad's decision. None was offered, and none was expected. His court was not a place where clever lawyers argued technicalities. It was a place where the prince looked at you, heard what you had to say, and told you what would happen to you. That was the end of the matter. He ate simply by the standards of royalty. The image of Vlad dining among impaled bodies, which appears in the German pamphlets and woodcuts that circulated in Western Europe during his lifetime and after his death, is almost certainly exaggeration or propaganda. But the grain of truth in it is that Vlad did not separate his working life from his personal life in the way that more conventionally squeamish rulers might have. He was comfortable in proximity to death. He had lived close to it his entire life. His afternoons were often given to military matters. He trained his cavalry personally, and by all accounts was an exceptional horseman. He was physically imposing. Contemporary descriptions suggest a man of medium height but powerful build, with dark, deep-set eyes that multiple sources describe as having an unsettling quality, as if they were looking at you from behind a mask of stillness. He wore his dark hair cut in the Romanian style of the era, and he dressed in the rich clothing of a Wallachian prince, though sources suggest he was not given to ostentation for its own sake. Everything about his appearance was meant to project authority rather than vanity. He spoke multiple languages fluently. He could converse with Ottoman envoys in Turkish, with Hungarian nobles in their own tongue, with his people in Romanian, and with priests and scholars in Slavonic. This linguistic facility was both practically useful and psychologically effective. There are accounts of him using his linguistic knowledge to catch people in lies, switching languages unexpectedly to observe the reaction of someone he suspected of deception. His evenings might be spent in council, receiving reports, planning military campaigns, or occasionally in the company of whatever personal relationships he maintained. His personal emotional life is largely opaque to us. We know he had at least 2 wives and fathered children, though the details are incomplete. His first wife died, possibly by suicide during the Ottoman siege of Poenari, throwing herself from the walls of the castle rather than be captured, according to the local legend of that place. He remarried, his second wife likely being a Hungarian noblewoman connected to the Hunyadi family. He fathered at least 2 or 3 sons. What did he feel when he was not performing the role of the terrifying prince? Did he laugh? Did he have friends in any genuine sense? We cannot know with certainty. What the sources suggest is a man of ferocious intelligence, of dark and sardonic humor. There are several stories, possibly apocryphal, of Vlad making wry observations at the moment of someone's execution that hint at a ghastly wit, and of a personality so controlled, so armored, that warmth was something he kept, if he kept it at all, entirely private. The German pamphlets about Vlad, which were among the first printed accounts of his crimes to circulate in Western Europe, and which used Gutenberg's new printing technology to spread his reputation across the continent, describe a man who seemed to take personal pleasure in cruelty, who would sit and eat his meals in view of the sufferings of those he had punished, who invented specific tortures for specific categories of offender. These accounts must be treated with caution. They were written by people with political motives to blacken his name. They exaggerate wildly in places, and they contain obvious errors and inventions, but they are not entirely without basis. They reflect a kernel of documented reality filtered through layers of propaganda and horror. The truth of Vlad appears to be more complex and in some ways more disturbing than pure sadism. He was not a man who tortured for the pleasure of it in the way a pathological sadist might. He was a man who had made a rational calculation, a terrible, monstrous calculation by our standards, but a coherent one by the logic of his world. That extreme violence, publicly and consistently applied, was the most effective instrument of political control, and he applied it with the cold consistency of a man implementing a policy, not the fevered excess of someone swept up in bloodlust. This makes him, in a strange way, more frightening than a simple monster would be, because monsters we can dismiss. But a highly intelligent, calculating person who has concluded that mass cruelty is justified and even necessary That is something else entirely. We must speak now of impalement. It is important to understand that impalement as a method of execution was not invented by Vlad III. It had been used across Eastern Europe and in the Ottoman Empire for centuries before him. The Ottomans themselves used it regularly for the execution of rebels and enemies. It was in the grim taxonomy of medieval punishments. Not exotic, it was known. What made Vlad different was not the invention of the method, but the scale, the deliberateness, and the psychological precision with which he employed it. Let me describe the method as it was practiced as plainly as I can. A wooden stake, typically sharpened at one end, was positioned beneath the condemned person. The stake was not driven through the body like a spear. That would be too quick. Instead, the condemned was lowered onto the stake so that it entered through the lower body, and the pole was then driven into the ground and raised upright. The weight of the body and the pull of gravity would do the rest. Death could take hours, sometimes longer. The person remained conscious, sometimes even capable of speech, for a considerable time before death came. It was suffering extended to its maximum possible duration. The psychological impact of this death was not limited to the condemned. A single impaled body on a stake was horrifying. A forest of them, dozens, hundreds, arranged in patterns, at varying heights, surrounding a city or lining a road, was something that entered the realm of psychological warfare, of deliberate spectacle, of a message so viscerally terrible that it could not be ignored or minimized. This is what Vlad created, not occasionally, not in moments of extreme provocation. Systematically, as a governing philosophy, he impaled enemies, he impaled thieves, he impaled corrupt officials, he impaled merchants who cheated. He impaled those who broke his laws in almost any significant way. He impaled Wallachian boyars who plotted against him. He impaled Saxon German merchants in Transylvania who he believed had cheated or betrayed him. He impaled Ottoman envoys who refused to remove their turbans in his presence. A story that has multiple versions but speaks to his absolute insistence on dominance in every interaction. He impaled armies. There is one scene from his reign that has captured the imagination of historians and storytellers for centuries because it encapsulates so completely the strange, terrible theater of his rule. It is the scene of what is sometimes called the Forest of the Impaled. In 1462, when the Ottoman army of Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia, intent on deposing Vlad once and for all, they advanced toward Targovista through increasingly disturbing terrain. And then, outside the walls of the capital, they encountered something that stopped even the hardened veterans of Mehmed's army in their tracks. A field. Some accounts say it stretched for miles, filled with impaled bodies. Approximately 20,000 of them, by the estimates of various chroniclers, though the actual number may have been smaller. The bodies were in varying stages of decomposition, impaled on stakes of varying heights, arranged according to what appears to have been a deliberate hierarchy, lesser people on shorter stakes, more important individuals on taller ones, Ottoman prisoners and officials on the highest of all. The smell alone must have been beyond description. The visual spectacle was one of such concentrated horror that Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople, who had seen more war and death than almost any living person, reportedly wept and turned away. He could not enter the city. Vlad had turned Targovist into a psychological fortress, not with walls or arrows or boiling oil, but with something that struck deeper than any of those. The sheer, overwhelming spectacle of what happens to those who challenge him. This is who Vlad the Impaler was as a ruler. He had concluded, in his years of watching and learning and suffering, that the fundamental currency of power was fear. That love was unreliable, that loyalty was conditional, but that absolute existential terror, fear not merely of punishment, but of a punishment so horrible that the mind recoiled from it. That kind of fear was a tool of government that, properly applied, could keep a throne secure. He was not wrong in his assessment. During his second reign, Wallachia was extraordinarily well governed by the standards of the time. Crime was minimal. because the punishments for crime were catastrophically severe. Corruption was almost non-existent, because Vlad punished corruption with the same impartiality he applied to everything else. Foreign merchants who passed through Wallachian territory found it safer and more honest than almost anywhere else in the region. The roads were patrolled, justice was swift, contracts were honored, the price was a river of blood. The capital of Wallachia in 1456 was Targovist, and it was to Targovist that Vlad III returned as prince, as ruler, as the man who now held the power of life and death over everyone in this principality. Let us describe the city. Targovist sat in the foothills below the Transylvanian Alps, a city of perhaps 10 to 20,000 people, which made it significant by the standards of the region. Its center was dominated by the princely court, a complex of buildings including the royal palace, the Great Chindia Tower, which served as both watchtower and treasury, the princely church of the Assumption, and a complex of administrative buildings, stables, barracks, and workshops. Around this royal core, the city spread in the typical medieval manner: merchants' quarters, craftsmen's streets, the houses of the boyar nobility with their own compounds and servants, churches and monasteries, and the inevitable ring of shacks and hovels where the poor lived in perpetual proximity to the powerful. Vlad established himself in the palace complex and immediately began to demonstrate the nature of his rule. The first thing he did was look at the boyars. The boyar class, the Wallachian nobility, was the perpetual nemesis of any ruling prince. These were the great landowners, the men who controlled the agricultural labor of the countryside, who commanded their own armed retinues, who sat in the prince's council, and whose collective support or opposition could make or break a ruler. They had deposed princes before. They had murdered princes before. They had murdered his father before. In the years of chaos and rapid succession that had characterized Wallachian politics before his second reign, many boyar families had played both sides, backing whoever seemed strongest at any given moment, shifting loyalty like the weather shifted in the mountains. Vlad had thought long and hard about the boyar problem during his years of exile. His conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The power of the boyar class had to be broken, thoroughly and permanently, if he was to rule with any security. And so, not long after his return to power, he struck. The exact circumstances of what happened next are described differently in different sources, and we must navigate these accounts carefully, because many of them were written by his enemies and contain exaggerations designed to blacken his name. But the core of what happened is not seriously disputed. He invited a large number of boyars, accounts vary between dozens and several hundred, to a feast at the palace in Targovist. It was ostensibly a celebration, a gathering of the great men of the realm to mark the new reign. The boyars came dressed in their finery, their servants in attendance, their jewelry glittering, their confidence palpable. They were the powerful men of Wallachia, and they expected to be treated as such. Vlad waited until the feast was in progress. He had his soldiers positioned around the hall, and then, at a signal, the doors were sealed. What followed was a purge. The exact number killed or imprisoned varies wildly depending on the source, from dozens to over 500. Those who were executed were, in many accounts, impaled on stakes in the courtyard outside. The younger and more physically capable among the prisoner class were reportedly bound and marched away to serve as forced labor on one of Vlad's most ambitious construction projects, the rebuilding and reinforcement of the fortress of Poenari, perched dramatically on a cliff in the Arges River Gorge. The story of Poenari is one of the most visceral images from Vlad's reign. The boyar prisoners, still dressed in their noble clothes, were forced to carry stone up the steep mountainside, laboring day and night until their clothing fell from their bodies in rags, and they worked half naked and bleeding. Those who could not continue were killed on the spot. The fortress that rose from this labor, Poenari Castle, Vlad's true stronghold, his retreat and refuge, was built with the blood and suffering of the very men who had murdered his family. Was this pure sadism? Or was it calculated political strategy? The answer, characteristically for Vlad, appears to be both simultaneously. He was certainly making a point so stark and violent that no boyar who heard of it could mistake the message. The new prince was not going to be played. He was not going to be manipulated or deposed. He was not going to be the puppet of noble factions, the old game of Wallachian politics, in which the nobility held the balance of power and princes ruled at their pleasure, was over. In its place, Vlad instituted a system of absolute personal rule. He elevated new men to positions of power, men from the lower nobility, from the merchant class, from the ranks of the military, men who owed everything to him and nothing to the old hereditary networks. He made himself accessible to common people in a way that was unusual for a medieval prince, hearing their complaints directly, acting as a final arbiter of justice, whose decisions could override those of the nobility. He cultivated a reputation among the common people as a prince of brutal but impartial justice, a man who punished the powerful and protected the weak, who kept his word absolutely and demanded it from others. This reputation was not entirely propaganda. There are multiple accounts from various sources, including some that are otherwise hostile to Vlad, of cases in which he intervened on behalf of ordinary peasants against the abuses of noble landlords. He imposed strict codes of honesty in trade, with severe punishments for merchants who cheated their customers. He reportedly had a golden cup placed at a public fountain so that any traveler could drink from it, and in all his years of rule, no one dared steal that cup. The message was consistent. In Vlad's Wallachia, the law was absolute, and the law was Vlad. Those who obeyed it would be protected. Those who broke it would be punished in ways they could not imagine, and the punishments were what he became famous for. The first reign of Vlad III, in late 1448, was too brief to leave any significant mark on history. He took the throne with Ottoman backing while John Hunyadi was away on campaign. But when Hunyadi returned, Vlad could not hold his position. He was driven out before the end of the year, forced to flee north across the Carpathians back into Transylvania. What followed was a period of approximately 8 years, from 1448 to 1456, during which Vlad lived in exile, moving between various locations, uncertain of his future, watching events unfold from a distance, and waiting and planning. The early part of this exile was spent in Moldavia, the principality to the northeast, where a cousin named Bogdan II ruled. Here, Vlad formed what appears to have been a genuine friendship, one of the very few in his life, with Bogdan's son, a young man named Stephen, who would later become one of the great rulers of Moldavia and would be remembered by history as Stephen the Great. Stephen the Great and Vlad the Impaler, cousins and friends, two of the most formidable princes of 15th century Eastern Europe, growing into their eventual power together during these years of exile and uncertainty. When Bogdan was himself murdered in 1451, assassination being, as we have seen, something of an occupational hazard for rulers of this region, Vlad moved on. He eventually made his way into Transylvania, and here occurred one of the most remarkable reversals of this entire story. He entered into the service, or at least the sphere of influence, of John Hunyadi, the very man who had organized the murder of his father. How do we explain this? Was it cynicism? Strategic necessity? Had Vlad buried his rage toward Hunyadi in the interests of political survival, concluding that alliance with the most powerful man in this part of the world was more important than personal vengeance? Almost certainly some combination of these factors. Hunyadi, for his part, appears to have seen in Vlad a useful instrument, a legitimate claimant to the Wallachian throne, who could be supported and controlled, who understood both the Wallachian and Ottoman worlds intimately, and who possessed obvious military ability. The relationship between Vlad and Hunyadi during these years is not well documented, but it appears to have been mutually calculating rather than warm. Two men using each other, Hunyadi providing protection and patronage, Vlad providing loyalty, intelligence about Ottoman methods and capabilities, and the promise of a useful ally if he ever regained his throne. During these years of exile, Vlad was also observing the world around him with extraordinary intensity. He watched how Hunyadi exercised power, the speed of his decision-making, the iron discipline he imposed on his troops, the brutal efficiency with which he dealt with enemies. He observed the boyar class of Wallachia, the powerful nobles who had always been the chief threat to any ruling prince, who had helped murder his father, who had buried his brother alive. He developed an almost pathological contempt for the boyar class, a contempt that would have devastating consequences when he came to power. He was also watching the wider geopolitical situation with the eyes of a strategist. In May of 1453, an event occurred that shook the entire Christian world to its foundations. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, young Mehem, who had been Radu's companion during Vlad's captivity, and who was now Sultan at the age of 21, successfully besieged and conquered Constantinople, the city of Constantine, the last remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, the great Christian civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years since the fall of Rome, was no more. Its last emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the final breach of the walls, and Mehmed the Conqueror rode his horse through the Hagia Sophia while his soldiers looted the greatest city in the Christian world. The fall of Constantinople sent a shockwave across Europe. It was not merely a military or political event. It was a theological catastrophe, an apocalyptic sign to many devout Christians that the end of times might truly be approaching. The Ottoman Empire was no longer merely a threat from the East. It was a triumphant power at the very heart of Europe, its sultan styling himself as the legitimate heir of Rome, the rightful lord of the world. For Vlad, this event must have had a complex resonance. He had lived inside the Ottoman world. He knew its strength. He knew the face of the sultan who had taken Constantinople, that young, brilliant, merciless face of Mehmed II, whom he had known as a youth, and toward whom he felt something between grudging respect and cold determination. Whatever personal relationships might have existed between them in the days of his captivity, they were now consumed by larger forces. Mehmed was the sultan of an empire that wanted Wallachia as a vassal state, and Vlad intended to rule Wallachia. John Hunyadi died in August of 1456 from plague shortly after winning the great victory at the Siege of Belgrade, a battle in which he had held off an Ottoman army and preserved Hungary from immediate invasion. His death created a power vacuum in the region, and it also opened the door for Vlad. Later in 1456, with Hungarian support that was now somewhat less organized but still significant, and with the backing of various Wallachian factions who had their own reasons for wanting a change of leadership, Vlad III crossed the mountains again, entered Wallachia, defeated his rival in battle, and claimed the throne of his fathers. He was approximately 25 years old. He had been in exile, in captivity, in waiting, for the better part of his entire life. He had watched his father murdered, his brother executed, his homeland given away and taken back again while he stood powerless. He had learned patience and fury in equal measure. He would not be patient much longer. The year 1442. Vlad III is approximately 11 or 12 years old. His younger brother Radu is perhaps 6 or 7. The Ottoman Sultan at this time is Murad II, a formidable and experienced ruler who has been expanding Ottoman power steadily across the Balkans. Murad is also a man of considerable political cunning. He understands that vassal princes like Vlad Dracul serve a useful purpose. They provide tribute, they act as buffers, they can be useful tools, but they must be kept in line. And the most effective way to keep a vassal prince loyal is to hold something precious hostage. Vlad Dracul was summoned to meet with the Sultan, or more likely with his representatives, somewhere along the Danube. It was presented as a diplomatic meeting, a conference to renew the terms of Wallachia's relationship with the Ottoman Empire. But it was a trap. When Vlad Dracul arrived, he was arrested, and the price of his release, the price of keeping his throne, was this. He must hand over his 2 younger sons as hostages. The older boy, Mircea, was left in Wallachia as heir apparent. But Vlad, the middle son, and young Radu, the youngest, were taken south, across the Danube, into Ottoman territory, into the empire of their enemies. Imagine that moment. Imagine being 12 years old and being taken from your father's hands, lifted up and carried away by soldiers in turbans and armor, speaking a language you barely understand, riding south through a landscape that grows increasingly foreign, increasingly strange, until you arrive in the Ottoman provincial centers of Anatolia, or perhaps Adrianople, the Ottoman capital in Europe, and you understand for the first time that this is not a visit. This is a prison without walls. You are a hostage, and your good behavior is all that stands between your father and a Turkish army marching on his capital. The boys were held primarily at the Ottoman court, and the precise location of their captivity has been debated. What is clear is that they spent the better part of 6 years in Ottoman custody, from approximately 1442 to 1448. 6 years, from early adolescence through the threshold of young manhood. These are among the most formative years of any person's life, and Vlad III spent them as a political prisoner of the most powerful empire on earth. What was this experience like? Here we must think carefully, because this period in Ottoman captivity would leave marks on Vlad so deep and so permanent that everything he later became can be traced, at least in part, back to these years. First, the conditions. The boys were not treated cruelly in the dungeon sense. They were not starved or physically abused, at least not routinely. Ottoman practice with high-status hostages was to integrate them into the life of the court to some degree, to educate them in Ottoman culture, to expose them to the sophistication and power of the empire, in the hope that this would breed cooperation or even genuine loyalty. They were given tutors. They had access to libraries. They learned to ride in the Ottoman style. They were exposed to Ottoman military discipline and organization, but this very sophistication was its own form of psychological warfare. The Ottomans were showing these boys what power truly looked like. The Ottoman court at Adrianople, or wherever they were held, was the center of an empire that stretched from the borders of Persia to the edge of Europe. The ceremonies, the wealth, the sheer organized force of the Ottoman military machine, all of this was on display, and it was deliberately on display to impress and overawe. For Radu, the younger and by all accounts more beautiful and gentle of the two brothers, this strategy worked. Radu eventually converted to Islam, became a favorite at the Ottoman court, and formed what appears to have been a genuine emotional attachment to Mehmed, the Sultan's son, who was of similar age. Radu would ultimately become one of the Ottomans' most useful instruments against his own brother. But for Vlad, the older and harder boy, the effect was entirely different. The Ottoman captivity did not break him or seduce him. It filled him with a cold, slow-burning rage. He watched, he learned, he absorbed every detail of Ottoman military tactics, every stratagem and method of intimidation, every technique of psychological dominance, and he stored it all away, not with gratitude or admiration, but with the calculating fury of a man who intends, someday, to use every lesson against the people who taught him. There is also the matter of physical punishment. Several sources, including a German pamphlet written during or after Vlad's second reign, suggest that during his captivity Vlad was beaten on a regular basis for various acts of insubordination. Whether this is entirely accurate is uncertain. Contemporary sources about Vlad are heavily colored by political agendas, but the portrait is plausible. The young prince would not have been easy to manage. He was proud, intelligent, and furious at his situation. A boy of that character, in those circumstances, would almost certainly have attracted punishment. And punishment, the mechanics of it, the psychology of it, the way pain and fear can be weaponized to control human behavior, was something Vlad III was studying in these years. Even if he was the one on the receiving end, the 6 years of captivity also separated Vlad from his homeland, from his people, from his culture. He returned to Wallachia, not as a native son, but almost as a stranger, a young man who had spent his most formative years in an alien world, who had been shaped by forces that had nothing to do with the mountains and forests of his birth. This displacement, this fracturing of identity, would leave a mark on his psychological makeup that no amount of subsequent Wallachian rule could entirely erase. And then came the news that completed the breaking and the hardening of Vlad III in November of 1447. While Vlad and Radu were still in Ottoman custody, his father, Vlad Dracul, the man who had handed his sons over to foreign captors, was murdered. He was killed by the forces of John Hunyadi, the great Hungarian warrior and regent, who had decided that Vlad Dracul's double-dealing between Hungary and the Ottomans had gone on long enough. Hunyadi's men killed Vlad Dracul in a marsh near Balteni. His older brother Mircea was also captured around this time and executed, reportedly by the boyars, the Wallachian nobility, who buried him alive. In a single stroke, Vlad III lost his father and his elder brother. He was now at approximately 17 years of age, still a hostage, still a prisoner, the last surviving male heir of his line in any position to claim the Wallachian throne. The Ottomans, for their part, decided that this situation created an opportunity. A new, hostile ruler had been installed in Wallachia by Hunyadi. The Ottomans wanted their own man in place. And here was Vlad Dracula, trained, educated, furious, and most importantly, theirs to deploy. In late 1448, the Ottomans released Vlad and gave him an Ottoman army, with Ottoman commanders supporting an Ottoman candidate for the Wallachian throne. Vlad rode north, across the Danube, back into the land of his birth, riding at the head of an Ottoman force toward the capital that should have been his. He was 17 or 18 years old. He was carrying 6 years of captivity, 2 murders of men he loved, and a burning cold fire in his chest that would never entirely go out. His first reign lasted approximately 2 months. He was born in the city of Sehisowara, a city in Transylvania, which at that time was not part of Wallachia, but was instead a province of the Kingdom of Hungary. Sehisowara was, and remains to this day, one of the most beautifully preserved medieval towns in all of Europe. Its citadel rises dramatically from a forested hilltop, its towers and colored spires visible for miles around. Its cobblestone streets wind between houses painted in ochre and amber and rust, their facades bearing the weight of centuries. The house in which Vlad III is believed to have been born still stands today, on the main square of the citadel. It is a modest building by the standards of a prince, reflecting the itinerant, precarious nature of his father's position at the time. Vlad Dracul was, in 1431, not yet the ruling prince of Wallachia. He was a claimant in waiting, a man biding his time in Transylvania under the patronage of King Sigismund, waiting for his moment. The year of Vlad III's birth is generally given as 1431, though some historians place it a year earlier or later. The exact month and day are unknown. What we know is that he was the second son of Vlad Dracul and his Transylvanian wife, a woman whose name and origins are somewhat obscure. She may have been a Transylvanian noblewoman, or possibly a Moldavian princess. The chronicles are not consistent on this point. He had an older brother, also named Mircea, after the famous grandfather, and he would later have a younger brother, one of the most fascinating and tragic figures in this entire story, a boy named Radu, who would be called Radu the Handsome. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Imagine the infant Vlad, swaddled in furs against the bitter Transylvanian winter, the son of a man who owned the title of prince but not yet the land that went with it, a child born into uncertainty, into the sharp political winds of a world at war with itself. His earliest memories would have been formed in Sichawara, in that narrow house on the Citadel Square, surrounded by the sounds of a town that was itself a crossroads, Hungarian to the west, Romanian to the south, Saxon-German merchants to the north, and the distant thunder of Ottoman armies somewhere beyond the mountains. What was childhood like for a prince of this era? We have no personal accounts from Vlad himself. He left no diaries, no letters of reflection. What we know of his inner life must be reconstructed from the actions he later took and the few contemporary descriptions that survive. but we can speak to the general shape of a princely education in this time and place. From early childhood, the sons of princes were educated in the martial arts. Riding was not a skill, it was a fundamental requirement of existence. By the age of 6 or 7, a boy of Vlad's station would have been on horseback regularly, learning to stay balanced, to control a large animal at full gallop, to manage the reins one-handed while the other swung a practice weapon. Archery followed, then sword work, then the study of tactics, of siegecraft, of how an army moved across terrain. But education in the 15th century was not purely martial. The Orthodox Church played a central role in the life of every Romanian prince, and religious instruction was woven through everything. Vlad would have learned to read and write in the old Slavonic script that served as the liturgical and administrative language of Wallachia and its Orthodox neighbors. He would have studied scripture, heard the liturgy chanted in that ancient resonant style of the Eastern Church, learned to pray with the prostrations and candlelit rituals of orthodoxy. He would also have learned several spoken languages, Romanian of course, but also Hungarian, which was the dominant language of the aristocracy in Transylvania, and almost certainly some knowledge of Slavonic languages, the lingua franca of diplomatic communication across Eastern Europe. Later, during his captivity, he would acquire Turkish as well. His father finally seized the throne of Wallachia in 1436, when Vlad III was around 5 or 6 years old. The family moved south, across the mountains, to the Wallachian capital at Târgoviste. For the young prince, this was his first experience of the world he was being prepared to rule. Târgoviste in the 1430s was a city of considerable importance. It had a royal court, a grand princely church, substantial walls, and a constant flow of merchants, diplomats, and warriors from all directions. It was a city that smelled of ambition and fear in equal measure. For the next several years, young Vlad grew up in the court of Târgoviste, watching his father navigate the impossible politics of a man caught between two great powers, the Hungarian kingdom to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the south. Both powers wanted Wallachia as a buffer state, a loyal vassal. Both were willing to apply considerable pressure to get what they wanted. Vlad Dracul was a member of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to fight the Ottomans. But he was also a pragmatic man who knew that defiance of the Sultan without sufficient support from Hungary was suicide, and so he walked a razor's edge, sometimes paying tribute to the Ottomans, sometimes joining Christian crusades against them, constantly calculating, constantly shifting, trying to keep his head and his throne simultaneously. The young Vlad watched all of this. He observed his father's calculations and compromises. He heard the arguments, the envoys, the threats, and he was learning, not just formally, but in the bone-deep way that children of turbulent households learn, absorbing the lessons of power and survival through every moment of every day. Then, in 1442, the world changed catastrophically for the young prince. The year is 1406. In a small but significant principality wedged between the Transylvanian Alps to the north and the Danube River to the south, a prince named Mircea the Elder rules the land known as Wallachia. Wallachia. Say that word slowly and let it settle in your mind like snowfall. It is not a name that appears much in modern geography. Today it forms the southern portion of Romania, but in the 15th century, it was its own sovereign entity, a principality of considerable strategic importance, because it sat directly on the frontier between the Christian kingdoms of Europe and the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. Mircea the Elder was, by most accounts, a statesman of rare skill. He understood that his small principality could not simply defy the Ottoman Turks through brute force alone. The Ottomans were the most formidable military power on earth at that time. Their armies had already swallowed vast swaths of southeastern Europe, gobbling up kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Bulgaria had fallen. Serbia had been crushed. The Byzantine Empire, once the jewel of the Eastern Christian world, was now a flickering candle in the city of Constantinople, surrounded on all sides by Turkish territory. Mircea navigated this impossible situation with considerable cunning. He fought the Ottomans when he could, made peace with them when he had to, and played the great powers of Europe against one another with the skill of a chess grandmaster. Under his rule, Wallachia maintained a fragile but real independence, but Mercia died in 1418, and what followed was chaos. This is something you must understand about Wallachia and its neighboring principalities during this period. The rules of succession were not fixed. There was no clean, simple system by which the eldest son automatically inherited the throne. Instead, any male member of the ruling dynasty, the Basarab line, could theoretically claim the crown. This meant that whenever a prince died, a brutal scramble for power immediately began. Rivals emerged from every direction. Foreign powers backed their preferred candidates. Assassinations were commonplace. Princes were blinded, strangled, deposed, and restored in dizzying succession. The throne of Wallachia changed hands so frequently during the 15 years after Mircea's death that historians struggle to keep track. Multiple claimants rose and fell, sometimes reigning for only a matter of months before being overthrown by a cousin or a brother or a neighboring king with an army at his back. Into this volatile world, sometime around the year 1430, though the precise date is disputed, a man named Vlad II, son of Mircea the Elder, began his own climb toward power, and it is here, with this man, that our story of Vlad the Impaler truly begins. Vlad II was a prince who understood power in the most visceral, practical sense. He was not a dreamer or an idealist. He was a survivor, and to survive in the political landscape of 15th century Wallachia, you had to be willing to make deals with the devil himself. In 1431, Vlad II was inducted into a remarkable organization, the Order of the Dragon. This was a chivalric order founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, and its stated purpose was the defense of Christendom against the Ottoman Turks. Members of the order wore a distinctive insignia, a dragon, coiled and biting its own tail, with a cross upon its back. It was an order of crusading knights, dedicated to the holy war against the infidel. The name given to Vlad II upon his induction into this order was Tranquil. In the Romanian of that era, Tranquil carried a double meaning. It meant both dragon and devil. Vlad wore this name with pride. He had it stamped onto his coins. He had it emblazoned on his banners. He was Vlad Tranquil, Vlad the Dragon, or Vlad the Devil, depending on whom you asked. Either translation felt appropriate, and his son would carry this name forward in a slightly different form. In Romanian, the suffix ul denotes the father, while the suffix ulia denotes the son of. So where the father was Dracul, the son would be known as Dracula, son of the dragon, son of the devil. His name was Vlad Dracula, and he was about to enter the world.